He stepped into the chapel like a shadow someone had forgotten to erase. The room was already full. Muffled sobs, fresh lilies, polished black shoes tapping against the marble. But when he walked in, no one turned. No one offered a seat. No one whispered his name. They had rehearsed this. It seemed the perfect funeral for a man everyone claimed to know. Everyone but the one person who had shared his mornings, his medicine, and his final moments. Nathaniel Brooks adjusted his collar, pulled his coat tighter around a chest already clenched, from holding back too much for too long, and walked to the last pew. Not even the ushers tried to stop him. They didn't need to. The silence did. He sat alone. From a distance, he looked misplaced, young, reserved, and unfamiliar to the Ward family, whose grief came in rehearsed tones and floral arrangements. Behind one pew, someone whispered, "That must be him." The one they said was living with Henry, the boy. A second voice, colder figures. They always show up at the end, hoping for a slice of something. He didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. In gas stations, at the hospital, even from the lawyer who tried to negotiate the smallest courtesy for him at this service: a seat, a name in the program, a line in the obituary. The answer had been no. Nathaniel's hand curled around a small object in his coat pocket. A ring. Once slipped onto his finger during a quiet night in the ICU when monitors beeped in rhythm with hope. It was sterling silver. Modest, worn thin, but to him, it weighed more than any inheritance they were fighting over. He wasn't there for a fight. He wasn't even there for recognition. He was there because he had promised not to leave Henry alone, not even after death. The man in the casket had once taught literature, adored obscure jazz records, and brewed at the gear of his cinnamon coffee every morning, even when his hands had begun to tremble. For 5 years, Nathaniel had stood in that kitchen doorway watching him pour, stir, and smile through everything they weren't allowed to say in public. Henry Ward, once a father, a professor, and a husband, had left behind a son, a past, and a love he had only ever whispered about behind closed doors. And now, the same people who had barely spoken to Henry in his final months were standing at the front of the chapel, reading poems they'd never heard him quote, and sharing stories they'd rewritten without asking. No one spoke of the Tuesday night he collapsed, the ambulance ride, the look in his eyes when he realized it was ending. Nathaniel did. He remembered all of it, and yet, here he was uninvited, unnamed, unwanted. He folded his hands, stared straight ahead, and said nothing. Not when a woman in a navy shawl shifted uncomfortably at the sight of him. Not when a teenager 2 rows ahead took a picture, probably to whisper later. Not even when someone behind him muttered the word gold digger, like it was a curse. Not a wound. He didn't belong in their story, but Henry had belonged in his, fully, entirely, until the very end. And that's why he came. He came to remember. Even if no one else did. Even if the man he loved had died with their life still hidden in a drawer somewhere, tucked behind tax papers and book drafts no one would ever finish reading. What Nathaniel didn't know, what none of them knew, was that before this service ended, a child would walk into the room and change everything. A boy who carried no inheritance, no bitterness, just the only truth that mattered, a name spoken with love, out loud, in front of everyone. But that moment hadn't come yet. For now, he waited, quiet, steady, not to be seen, but to remember, not to prove anything, but to keep a promise made in softer hours, when love didn't need to be defended, just lived. If you've ever stood in the back row of someone else's story, if you've ever loved someone so fully the world refused to see it, subscribe to Heart Stories. Because some stories, no matter how quietly lived, deserve to be heard. There had been no wedding, no license, no shared health insurance, but there had been years, 5 of them. 5 winters of Henry reminding Nathaniel to wear gloves, and 5 summers of Nathaniel convincing Henry to try iced tea instead of hot. 5 years of routines so ordinary they became sacred. Mornings began with music at Coltrane, Monk, sometimes just the hum of the kettle. Evenings ended with books. Some Henry reread aloud from memory. Others Nathaniel brought home from secondhand stores with the corners already folded. They had lived quietly, not because they were afraid, but because quiet was the only way the world didn't ask questions. Henry had once been married, long before they met, the kind of marriage that began with expectations and ended in exhaustion. From that union came a child bright-eyed, stubborn, curious, a boy Henry loved with everything he had, even when he didn't always know how to show it right. The boy was barely a year old when the divorce was finalized. His mother, a sharp and capable woman, was given primary custody, but Henry never missed a single weekend. When Nathaniel entered Henry's life, the boy had just turned 1, too young to speak, but old enough to reach out and grab a stranger's thumb without fear. Henry was cautious at first. He called Nathaniel a friend in front of the child, careful not to shift the balance of what had already been difficult. But children don't ask for labels. They learn from presence. They learn from hands that tie shoelaces and pack lunches. They learn from stories read 3 times in a row and lullabies sung off key. By the time the boy was 3, he had 2 dads, Daddy Henry and Daddy Nathan. No one corrected him, not even his mother, because over time, Nathaniel had become more than just a partner. He had become a fixture in that child's sense of home. He was there when the fever spiked at midnight. He was there at the parents-teacher conference Henry couldn't attend. He was the one who remembered the nightlight had to be blue, not green, or else the dreams would come. The decision had been mutual. When the boy's mother received a job offer across the country, Henry had offered to care for the child full-time. She had hesitated, unsure if it was right to leave her son with 2 men in a society still catching up. But she had known Henry, and she had watched Nathaniel. She had said yes, not legally, not with courts or custody papers, but with handwritten notes, messages, weekends swapped, and trust given quietly. For almost 2 years, that child had known only one home, the one with books stacked across the window and pancake batter spilled on the floor every Sunday. The one where 2 men took turns doing bedtime voices, where his drawings were taped to the fridge beside Henry's lecture notes and Nathaniel's grocery lists. Then Henry got sick. It started small, forgetting the stove, missing names, losing the thread mid-sentence. At first they thought it was stress, then a minor stroke. Then the scans showed something deeper. The final year blurred. There were hospice forms, hospital nights, the smell of antiseptic and the feel of worn skin under trembling hands. Nathaniel took time off work. Full-time caregiving didn't come with applause, only quiet resilience. And through it all, the boy stayed, sometimes at school, sometimes with Ann and his mother, but often in the apartment with the bookshelf he couldn't reach, where his 2 daddies taught him that love didn't always look like the movies, but it was still love. Nathaniel still remembered the last night. Henry couldn't speak. His eyes had grown dim, his body too tired to respond. But when Nathaniel placed the boy's drawing in his hand, a messy crayon picture of 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a blue sky, Henry had smiled, just slightly, before closing his eyes. After that, the world got louder. The funeral was arranged without Nathaniel. The family had taken over, claiming what they said was theirs, his name, his legacy, his image. They erased what didn't fit. They didn't mention the apartment. They didn't mention the child. And they certainly didn't mention Nathaniel. But what they didn't know, what they refused to acknowledge, was that love had been lived, fully, quietly, completely. And even though he now sat in the last pew like a stranger, Nathaniel had once been the center of someone's world. He had been Henry's home, and for one little boy, he still was. The eulogy was still echoing off the chapel walls when Nathaniel lowered his gaze to the folded hands in his lap. He hadn't come to speak. He hadn't even brought a suit meant for standing at a podium. He came with one photo in his coat and a promise in his chest, knowing neither had a place here. Up front, the family moved through grief like it was performance art, precise, polished, and curated. Henry's sister read a passage from Whitman. A nephew talked about fishing trips that likely hadn't happened in years. Even Henry's mother, sharp and rigid in her mourning dress, managed to say something soft about childhood, like it excused her silence in his final months. Nathaniel remained silent. He could feel the weight of glances behind him. They were watching him the way people observe a stain too noticeable to ignore, too impolite to address directly. Someone behind him whispered loud enough for it to sting. "That's the man who lived with him, right? Yeah, the roommate. I heard he was younger, much younger. They say he's after the estate." The words dropped like stones. No one bothered to lower their voices. It was as if his presence had validated every suspicion, every bias they'd nurtured behind closed doors. In their eyes, Nathaniel wasn't a partner. He wasn't family. He was a story they didn't want to admit might be true. He adjusted his position on the pew, not out of discomfort, but to keep from unraveling. The chapel light streamed through stained glass, casting colored patterns on the floor. It danced across his shoes but never reached his hands. That felt fitting. He thought of the apartment, the coffee mug still sitting in the sink, the blanket Henry always took from him during movie nights, the empty chair at the kitchen table. He thought of the child's laughter echoing down the hall, the way Henry would hum when brushing the boy's hair. The three of them, squeezed onto one couch, watching cartoons none of them liked but couldn't turn off. Those were things no one in this room had seen. And that was the thing about absence. It made people believe they could rewrite the parts they never witnessed. To them, Henry had been a brother, a professor, a father, roles they understood and could contain, but a man who loved another man who raised a child with him. That didn't fit, so they cut it out. The obituary made no mention of Nathaniel. It listed former spouses, surviving siblings, academic awards, and philanthropic efforts. The child wasn't listed either, only a vague reference to family members. The story had been trimmed to what was socially acceptable, sanitized. Easier to explain, Nathaniel had kept the obituary clipping anyway, not out of sentimentality, but as proof. Not everything beautiful gets remembered the way it deserves. Near the end of the service, a woman in a pearl brooch approached the podium. She was someone Nathaniel had seen once, maybe at a Thanksgiving, long ago, before things had been official, before labels. She looked directly at him as she spoke. "We thank everyone for coming to celebrate a life lived with dignity and purpose. Henry Ward was a pillar in our family, a man of integrity. He is survived by those who loved him deeply and those who will carry his legacy forward." There was a pause, then she added, almost like punctuation, "Let us remember that he lived exactly as he wished." Nathaniel nearly laughed. Exactly as he wished, the man who waited until his final month to whisper, "I wish I had walked beside you in daylight." The man who flinched every time a family member called during dinner. The man who once held his hand in an elevator, but dropped it the second the doors opened. Henry had lived with restraint, with fear, and with moments of joy too fleeting to be called freedom. He didn't live exactly as he wished. He lived within what he was allowed. And now, even in death, the story being told was someone else's version. Nathaniel reached into his coat and brushed his fingers against the edge of the photo he'd brought. It was crinkled, overhandled, a picture the boy had drawn months ago. Henry, Nathaniel, and himself, all holding hands, beneath a lopsided rainbow. He had planned to place it inside the casket, but they had already sealed it shut. He wondered if anyone would ever ask about that boy, if any of them even remembered his name, if they would mention him when they sat down for dinner later, recalling the day their relative passed with honor and pride. Nathaniel stood up before the service ended, not in protest, not in defeat. He just couldn't listen to a version of Henry that never included him. As he moved quietly toward the exit, a few heads turned. No one stopped him. No one called his name. No one asked why his eyes were red. They had erased him in life. They would not reclaim him in death. But fate had not finished speaking. Just as Nathaniel reached the heavy chapel doors, a small voice cut through the silence. "Daddy Nathan." It wasn't imagined. It wasn't a memory. It was real. And it was coming closer. The sound stopped him cold. Not grief, not disbelief, but something else entirely: recognition. A voice that didn't belong to the careful mourning of adults. It was lighter, urgent, too young to know silence, too pure to care for protocol. "Daddy Nathan." Nathaniel turned. The doors hadn't even closed behind him when a small figure broke through them. A boy, short legs running in quick, determined strides, cheeks flushed with the kind of breathless energy only children can carry into places too still. In his hands, a crumpled paper. On his face, a panic only comfort could fix. He reached Nathaniel and wrapped his arms around his leg. "There you are," the boy said, the words muffled by the fabric of Nathaniel's coat. And just like that, everything stopped. Inside the chapel, heads turned in waves. The soft rustle of clothing replaced scripted eulogies. Rows of perfectly composed faces suddenly forgot how to keep their expressions in check. No one moved. Not even the woman standing near the front, the boy's mother. She stood in the aisle, still in her gray coat, still watching, eyes tired but soft. And when Nathaniel looked at her, she gave the smallest nod. Not as permission, not even as approval, but something quieter: acknowledgement. The boy let go just enough to look up, clutching his drawing in one hand. "I made this for both of you," he said, voice proud but trembling. "But Daddy Henry's already sleeping, so you can have it now." Nathaniel knelt down. His knees touched the marble as gently as his fingers touched the paper. The drawing was simple: 3 figures holding hands. One tall, one shorter, one in the middle with curly hair and no shoes. A sun with a crooked smile hung in the corner. And underneath, 3 names written in shaky letters: Henry, Nathaniel, me. The boy didn't wait for praise. Instead, he leaned forward, pressed his forehead against Nathaniel's chest, and whispered, "They wouldn't let me talk in there. But I missed you." It was the first honest sentence spoken that morning. Not rehearsed, not filtered through grief etiquette, just truth. And with that one truth, the entire room shifted. What had once been a space full of whispered judgment now held something else: a reckoning. No one said it out loud. No one had to. The sight of a 5-year-old clinging to the man they had erased was louder than any sermon. The boy's mother approached slowly. She didn't reach for her son. She didn't ask for explanations. She simply stood beside them and watched. In her eyes, there was history grief layered on top of acceptance, and perhaps a kind of sorrow that things hadn't always been easy. But she wasn't there to take the child away. Nathaniel rose, holding the drawing in one hand and the boy's small fingers in the other. He didn't look at the congregation. He didn't have to. Whatever they had chosen to believe about him, whatever assumptions had brought them comfort or superiority, none of it could stand against what had just unfolded in silence. Because love, when seen through the eyes of a child, doesn't require permission. They walked back to the front, past the pews where names and bloodlines had once decided belonging, past people who had spoken of legacy without ever asking who had lived beside it. And at the casket, Nathaniel stopped. He didn't cry. Not this time. He unfolded the drawing and laid it gently atop the polished wood. Then he placed the boy's hand on top of it. "Goodbye, Daddy Henry," the child whispered. It wasn't loud, but it was heard. And for the first time that morning, the chapel felt like it had remembered something true. When they turned to leave, the boy tugged Nathaniel's coat and asked quietly, "Can we go home now?" Nathaniel nodded, and without another glance behind, they stepped outside. The sunlight had shifted since he arrived. It wasn't warmer, but it was real. Sometimes, that's enough. The chapel door closed behind them, but Nathaniel didn't let go of the child's hand. Not when they reached the sidewalk. Not when the wind picked up. Not even when the boy asked again, in a softer voice this time. "Are we really going home?" He nodded, but first, there was one more stop. The lawyer had called earlier that week. Henry's final arrangements were handled by the family, but his private estate, his written will, those had not been left to chance. They arrived at the office just after lunch. The receptionist didn't ask questions. Nathaniel's name was already highlighted on the visitor sheet. A few minutes later, he was seated across from a man in a charcoal suit who didn't offer condolences. Only a manila folder and a quiet. He planned everything. Inside the folder was a letter handwritten in Henry's unmistakable script. There were no legal words, no formal phrasing, just sentences that sounded like breath released after being held for too long. It began with this: "If you're reading this, it means I wasn't brave enough in life, but maybe I can still make things right in death." Nathaniel kept reading. Henry wrote about their mornings, about jazz records and burned toast, about the moment he knew Nathaniel was more than love, he was home. He wrote about the boy and how seeing them together had given him a kind of peace he never thought he deserved. And then came the words Nathaniel had never expected. "Even now, I've requested that temporary custody be granted to you. If she agrees, she always trusted you more than she let on, and I trust you more than anyone else in the world." There was a second page, the legal one. It outlined the transfer of Henry's personal effects, his share of the apartment, his modest savings, his copyrights, and the piano the boy had learned to play. It all went to Nathaniel, not as compensation, not as proof, but as a final declaration that what they had was real. At the bottom, a signature dated just a week before the final hospital stay, and below it, a note scrawled in the margin: "I hope this helps the world remember what they tried to ignore." Nathaniel folded the letter and pressed it to his chest. He didn't cry, not in front of the boy. They left the office with no applause, no dramatic confrontation, just quiet certainty, the kind of silence that feels full, not empty. Weeks passed. The boy settled back into the rhythm of home. He colored outside the lines again. He left crumbs on the couch again. And each night before sleeping, he asked Nathaniel to read the same book, the one Henry used to read, the one with the dragon who had two dads. No one from the funeral reached out, not the sister, not the cousin with the fishing story, not even the woman in the pearl brooch who had spoken like she knew who Henry really was. It didn't matter. One morning, Nathaniel placed the drawing from the funeral inside a wooden frame and set it above the fireplace. Not for guests, not for proof, just to remember. Because sometimes the loudest kind of love is the one you don't need to explain anymore. And when the boy asked one day, "Will people still think we're a family?" Nathaniel answered, without hesitation, "We are a family because love doesn't need permission." Have you ever loved someone so deeply, yet the world refused to see it? Tell us in the comments. Your truth might be the reminder someone else needs today. And if this story found a quiet place in your heart, subscribe to Heart Stories, because some truths are too important to stay hidden.